Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm a librarian with the Chicago Public Library. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming. Today's event is part of our Voices for Justice series, which seeks to highlight authors and thought leaders who can spark conversations in the areas of social justice. This program is also in celebration of Pride Month, and we encourage everyone watching to check out more events that our Rainbow Committee here at the library will work so hard to curate every year. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience for a brief Q&A following the conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat. It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Oliverio Rodriguez. Oli Rodriguez is an interdisciplinary artist working in filmmaking, video, photography, performance, and writing. Currently, he is an assistant professor in the art department at California State University, Los Angeles. His projects conceptually intersect with the notions of subversive desire, passing, visualizing the performativity of gender, explorations and appropriation, performative interactions with the public as collaborator, and a commitment to referencing historical movements in gender, racial, and feminist histories. He curated the exhibition, The Great Refusal, taking on new queer aesthetics at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He is a part of the monograph, Confronting the Abject, named from his research theme class that he co-taught with Catherine Opie at SAIC. His book, The Papi Project, archives the AIDS pandemic through archival images, video, photography, and performance. This includes his Queer, People of Color, Family, and Chosen Family in Chicago during the 1980s. He just completed his feature-length documentary, Lindale, visualizing the nuanced relationships between family members as they navigate childhood neglect, queer identities, and generational trauma. Rodriguez has screened, performed, lectured, and exhibited his works internationally and nationally. I want to thank them for leading the discussion with tonight's keynote speaker. And a reminder, before I turn it over, we welcome your questions and thoughts throughout tonight's program. So please place them in the comments section and we will pass them on to our speaker. And so with that, I'm happy to hand the program off to Oli.
Hi there, everyone. I'd like to introduce HMO for the program tonight. HMO is a poet, artist, and educator whose work celebrates trans people, history, and culture. They are the author of The Plural, The Blurring, and editor of Subject to Change, Trans Poetry and Conversation. HMO was an artist in residence at the Newberry Library, researching the Chicago Protest Collection. They've attended the Lambda Literary Writers Retreat and the Tin House Writers Workshop. Their latest book, There Are Trans People Here, includes a study guide for trans youth, educators, and artists, available for free online through Haymarket Books. Welcome each.
Thank you, friends. Hi, everybody. I'm gonna start off reading just a couple of poems from the book before we get into the conversation. And I'm going to start off with the very first poem, the title poem. This is There Are Trans People Here. And it's after a poem by Jamal May called There Are Birds Here. There are trans people here. So many trans people here is what I am trying to say. When they say we are all trapped in the wrong body, imposter, impossible, no. We are on the bus next to you, in the cubicle next to you, in the checkout line next to you. Some of us are sex workers, teachers, artists, nurses, homeless, unemployed, and hungry too. We are as real and complicated as anyone else, but they won't Stop murdering. Stop legislating. Stop imprisoning. Stop claiming we are ruining our countries, families, friendships, and futures too, when every day we awaken to build them anew. On Trans Street, everyone knows your chosen name. On Trans Street, there are bungalows, courtyard buildings, and rent control. On Trans Street, there are bike lanes, abundant wheelchair ramps, and prompt snow removal. On Trans Street, there is free STI and HIV testing. Doctors prescribe hormones and perform abortions without a fight. On Trans Street, there is a school where trans history is taught by trans teachers. On Trans Street, there is a mural of Miss Major at Stonewall. On Trans Street, Juliana Huxtable is the resident DJ. On Trans Street, no TERFs are allowed. On Trans Street, no catcalling is allowed. On Trans Street, there are no prisons, no checkpoints, no police stations, no military bases, no detention centers. On Trans Street, the cemetery is always full of visitors. On Trans Street, we are never alone. This next poem is one of my favorite in the collection. It's after Ross Gay, who is one of the most delightful poets on this earth. This poem is called Dysphoria Is Not My Name. Joy brought me here, lifted me onto this bed on wheels, tied drawstrings behind the back of my gown, affixed a hairnet atop my crown. Look, in this country alone, there are millions of us, naturally occurring sweet things with names we carved ourselves. No matter what the doctors say, I castrated myself and I'm all smiles. There are so many surgeries I could have had, but timing is everything. It's a new decade, a new life. Purple is the color of my scars. Purple is my favorite color. I'm forever in bloom. City of Trans Liberation, where statues of Lou and Sylvia dance in the streets, where no kids are kicked out or run away from home, where nobody asks for ID or our real names, where everybody has a body they believe in, where we can go outside in the daytime without being harassed, where we are taught to love instead of kill ourselves, where Trans Day of Remembrance celebrates those who died of natural causes, where there are no borders between who we were and who we are becoming. I'm going to end with a prayer. This is prayer for my trans siblings. Praised are you who remember Leela and Blake, Grayson and Mark, Layleen and Leslie. Praised are you who hold up the trans universe, who agitate and educate, migrate and radiate. Praised are you who shelter us in libraries and nursing homes, locker rooms and train cars, prison cells and hospital beds. Praised are you who clothe us in combat boots and leggings, button-ups and chainmail, leather and pleather, faux fur and sequins. Praised are you who share our joy in naming and renaming, screaming and dreaming, injecting and rejecting. Praised are you who soothe us from the harms we inflict on ourselves and each other. Let us hope for a day when we no longer need to pray for our safety. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing, HMO, and congrats on the book. I really appreciate it. I was doing a lot of this after each one. I love to start out just thinking about like how this all came together. Like maybe hearing about the beginnings of putting this together, the poems, maybe, yeah, the beginnings of it. Is it, yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so how did this body of work begin? It began with my desire to imagine and also create a trans future for myself. So a lot of my previous work was very much rooted in the present or in the past. And I realized that I didn't know what a trans future could look like. I didn't know what sorts of endless possibilities could exist for my life. And I felt like I didn't have, you know, the space, the time, the energy, the imagination to think about the future, because so much of my life was spent just trying to remind people and like quote unquote prove that I exist in the present. So I wasn't really able to dream or to use my imagination in a forward moving way. And that's just not like a great way to live. And I was really inspired when I attended an event for this book called To Survive on the Shore, which is a collection of photographs of trans elders. And there was also an in-person event. There's a number of Chicago people, some of whom you know, like Mickey Mahoney in the book, and Mama Gloria, who just passed away like a week or so ago here in Chicago, is on the cover. And being at that event made me realize that it's possible to age as a trans person and to grow and to live a long life and just to reach that that sort of age. And that was something I hadn't really considered before. I felt like I didn't have examples of what it looks like to be trans and like grown up, to be trans and middle aged, to be a trans elder. And those were things that I was really lacking in my life. And aside from that, I have also been really influenced by a lot of abolitionist organizing in Chicago, and a lot of activists and artists that I know have really pushed me and taught me to make art that is deeply connected to social movements. And because of that, and because of like this history of Chicago artists working in community, doing a lot of community organizing, cultural organizing, I started integrating, not just my personal vision or my personal life, what I wanted that to look like in the future, but also what type of city I would love Chicago to be, right? And that like kind of realizing a lot of the dreams that people have been organizing for and pushing for, whether that's like reparations for survivors of police torture, or a specific monuments, or like mental health care, the end of ICE, right? All these different things. And so I've kind of tried to braid all those different elements together. And I think what holds them is really just like this desire for a more radical and liberatory future.
For sure. And I feel that in terms of reading your book, for sure. And also, yes, rest in power, Mama Gloria. And this kind of leads into the next question a bit, too, in relation to like how the role of Chicago in the poems, but also like in the book, but also I feel like it's its character in itself. So I'd love to hear about. I mean, you've mentioned a lot of specifics in relation to Chicago, but how do you see Chicago in relation to the poems and their intersection?
Yeah, so I think Chicago has allowed me to like cultivate my imagination, and I'm so influenced by so many Chicago writers in particular, and there's several poems in the book after Chicago writers, after people who spent time in Chicago, who wrote about Chicago, like Jamila Woods, Martina Spada. And I think that the way that I really see it showing up in my work now, aside from like those very like clear connections, is also just in what's important to me as an artist, and valuing community and making sure that the art is not the end, but is actually like an integral part of imagining and like changing the world, right? And like making a better city. And I think, I'm most concerned with my work having a value, like having a use value, being like utilitarian in this sort of like Midwestern and Chicago way. I want my work to be useful, and I want people to be able to use it. And I think there's many different ways that can look like, whether that's teachers being able to use the study guide that we made for this book in their classrooms, or folks like being able to like organize a book group at their high school or college or wherever around the book, whether it means like, a college or community center is like inviting other trans poets or trans people into their spaces to speak or talk with them. And then like on like the really small personal level, like, if it's actually changing, right, trans people's relationships to the world in like positive, healthy, and healing ways. I think for me, this book was really healing, and I hope that it is healing for other trans folks as well. And I never want the art just to sort of like live on its own, out of its own merit, but to be useful to people, to be used as like an organizing tool, to be used to push for more radical ideas and a more just city. And I think that's something that so many Chicago artists I know, whether that's like showing up at parades or showing up at protests with like signs that are artistic, or, you know, I've like made a poster that says there are trans people here and like marched with that at the Dyke March. Things like that. It's just so incorporated. And I think that the art in Chicago has like a deep soul and a deep political history. And I hope that, you know, my work is kind of seen in that light and in that lineage as well.
For sure. Thanks for sharing that. And I do see like how the intersection relation to Chicago in there, but I also think a lot about collaboration, and not necessarily like in terms of writing, but also like the names you're referencing, the specific like locations. But I'd love to hear how you think about collaboration, or how you think about it in terms of the poems, in terms of your writing. So I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, so there's a poem in the book called Trans Care that almost like every line or stanza mentions a different person. And the poem names all these different people in my life, and like ways that they have cared for me, specifically provided aftercare, like after a major surgery. And to me, trans care is communal care. And that poem is so simple. It's literally just a list of names of people and meals they've brought me and places they've driven me and, you know, appointments that they came with me to. And it's just so powerful because the people who are collaborating to make like my daily life not only livable and survivable, but also who are working with me and caring for me in ways that allow me to like live this beautiful trans life. There's no book without trans care. Like there's no me in my present state without trans care. And I think that that is like all the people who are taking care of me, whether that's friends or chosen family or teachers or strangers or doctors or therapists. Those are like my greatest collaborators. And those are the people who really allow me to make art in the first place, and especially like provide me with the stability to be able to create work like this.
Thanks for sharing that. It's also really important to hear and to document and evidence. So that kind of goes into my next question. Like I'd love to hear some of the thoughts around archive and evidence or artifact, or I just feel like there's so much documentation in the work. I feel like I ask you a question and then I'm answering it, but I think like such importance there with those terms. So how do you see like it as documentation or evidence or artifact, or how in terms of how the poem lives, right?
Yeah, so there's a lot of trans history in this book, and one of the fascinating things about queer and trans history to me is how much effort there is to erase it, to ban it, to hide it, to deny it, even in the face of very clear evidence. I mean, I was talking with you just a few days ago about visiting like Georgia O'Keeffe's studio and how the tour guide there was claiming that Georgia O'Keeffe was straight when she very much was not. And there's a well-documented history of her queerness. And, you know, like that sort of erasure and denial, especially from official sources, even from family sources, is really common. And one of the things that I really tried to do with this book was to connect moments in trans history to my own life and to my own family history. So there's a poem in the book, for example, called "The Riots Must Continue." And it's about how my grandmother and my great-grandmother lived down the street in Philadelphia from Dewey's Diner, where there was an early pre-Stonewall protest and sit-in and resistance to harassment by a lot of queer folks. And being able, like even just being able to go in person and see that proximity, to see both how close, right, this location of the former diner was with how close it was to my grandmother and great-grandmother's apartment. That was really powerful to me. And doing that sort of work of like linking my own like personal stories and family stories to moments of resistance in queer history and in trans history has been really powerful. And it's also made me just feel like I have more of a place in my family, and that my family is not like, trans ancestors are also a part of my family, right? Like even if I'm not quote unquote biologically related to many trans ancestors or trans people who I know of in my family that I can identify, right? There's like a long lineage of trans elders and ancestors who I can look to, and those people made it possible for me to exist and have influenced the way that I see the world and who I am just as much, if not more so, than the family that I grew up in.
Thanks for sharing that. It's super important too, I think, in terms of the work. And as you mentioned, like a lot of straight washing, you know, in terms of history and whitewashing as well. I mean, we have to like have that voice. And so I'm grateful to read it. And thanks for sharing. I do want to hear about like, how do you start? Like, what's your process like in writing? Are there things that obviously things that inspire you, and I see them transpire, but I'd love to hear a little bit about how do you start?
Yeah, it really depends. I don't have like one sort of set or disciplined way that I repeat over and over again. Some of these poems began in workshop with other poets. So I'm a huge fan of taking workshops as a student from other poets and artists, and also teaching them. And in both those spaces, I find that just having even a small community of poets and writers and artists who are in a room together, working on a similar prompt or responding to a similar poem or piece of artwork, and then just sharing with each other, that is super helpful for me. I generate a lot of work in workshop space or in classes. I also, while working on this book, was part of a collective of queer writers, and we would pretty much meet about once a month. Before the pandemic, we would meet in person, and we would just share work with each other. We would critique each other. we would give feedback to each other, answer each other's questions, and just having that small group of people. Again, this was like 4 to 5 people, and really just being able to talk about and share my work with people who I trust, especially in its early stages, is crucial to me developing new work and feeling confident about it. I also sometimes, like the poem about Philadelphia I mentioned, only came because I went on a trip to Philadelphia. And there's a couple of poems that came out of that trip. Sometimes poems come from news articles, sometimes poems come from, there's a series of poems in the beginning of the book. One is called At the Chicago Marathon, which is about my friend Logan running the Chicago Marathon, and a little bit of like trans magic that happened during that. So yeah, poems just come from often working with other artists, talking with other writers, and like living my life and trying to figure out what are the questions that I have about my past and about my future, and how can I look to history and also to organizers and activists for ways to try and navigate those questions.
For sure. Thanks. You mentioned visual art, and I'd love to hear about like your practice. There's a piece behind you, but I'd love to hear about your practice in relation to how do you see visual art and your poetry, or how did conversation, interaction?
Yeah, so I really hate the process of writing, but I love the process of making visual art. I think part of it just has to do with like the physicality of it. When I'm making a big piece of work, you know, it's often going to be displayed somewhere, and going to be displayed often somewhere public where people can go and see it. A similar flag to the one behind me, for example, hung outside the Leather Archives and Museum a couple of years ago, and people just walking on the street in Rogers Park were able to see it and take photos with it for a good chunk of time. And I think in some ways, it's also easier for me to make visual art because I am often taking like these short little phrases, whether it's like, I am alive, or there are trans people here. And those are just like the lines of a poem, essentially. And I really enjoy being able to just share the work in a physical way, especially being able to share prints, to hand out posters, to sell them, to see them used in marches and see them on the walls of people's homes and at like trans inclusive or welcoming spaces. Again, it just goes back to being able to make work and share it in a way that is meant for the public, and that is reminding people that trans people exist, and doing so in a way that that is unapologetic. And that's just, I think, a theme that appears in both my writing and my visual work.
Thanks for sharing. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the flags. Is that I know you've been making them, and are they like the same size? Are they, I mean, the Leather Archive Museum, I know that you mentioned it hanging, but I'd love to hear your why flags. I mean, I have some ideas on why, but why flag, why the structure, and also what you're writing on them too.
Yeah, so I mean, flags are representations of community. Oftentimes they're representations of nationalism or a particular country or place or territory. And I think that flags can be used in different and more exciting and creative ways than just literally representing a place. And so I've tried to like create my own flags that represent or like remix or recreate or paint over often pre-existing flags, whether that's the Chicago flag or the trans flag. And I just love, there used to be a flagpole and a project at UIC called Temporary Allegiance, and anyone could just put a flag on this flagpole, and it was displayed there, like right next to the highway. And I loved that so much. And I think for me, like making flags and making banners, again, like they're just ways of like announcing to people, like, I'm here, I am like living and existing, and I am not afraid or ashamed, or, you know, and they're also just so colorful. There's so many different shapes, so many different patterns, and they're often just really bold. And yeah, there's so many reasons why I love flags, and I definitely have like a little collection of flags. But for me, it's like just a visual marker and a way to represent community, and to do so in a way that isn't necessarily about state power or national power, is more so about community and sharing space with people and affirming people's existence.
Got you. Thanks for sharing that. And I also feel like the wonderfully bold, forthcoming, like I see a parallel in terms of the flags and like your work. And so I'm glad for both of their existence. So thanks for sharing that. You talked a lot about your different collaborations in spaces with particular spaces. And I'd love to hear any others or future ones that you'd like to collaborate with, given the role of Chicago and also your work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think about another word for collaboration is relationship. And I think that having relationships, especially with other Chicago artists and writers like yourself, is so important to me. And building trust within those relationships, responding to each other's work, teaching each other, learning from each other. Like relationships and community are at the core of how I always want to be working. So I'm wondering, for you, I guess, how have you seen over time, because we've known each other for about a decade now, give or take. How have you seen like our work relating to each other, responding to each other? I know, for example, I love and often think of the flag that you made that was at the DePaul Art Museum. That was like a print of your photo of the Belmont Rocks. I know you've been writing poetry more recently and publishing that poetry and just doing more writing in general, which is really beautiful to see. And I'm excited to just read more of your writing. Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about just how you've seen like our work evolve in relation to each other.
For sure. I think it's also important to note that a lot of things you're saying, I completely also am working in / believe in. So I'm thinking about collaboration and thinking about Chicago and thinking about community and writing for community, or even autobiography or documentation or artifact, archive. I feel like are all terms that I'm thinking about in the questions I'm asking you, but also our roles as we move through visual art, we move through poetry, and I have worked in parallel. I feel like with the flags as well, and having a cruising spot, literally like billowing in the air above work in a gallery, like how immense size the flag is, but also its representation, as you talked about. And we have known each other a decade. I love it. It's like we've gone through this like metamorphosis, I feel like, in terms of how we see personally and professionally, how we morph and change and build and grow. And then also have like wonderful text message exchanges and now here these wonderful conversations. But I love the ability to also the coming to a medium and sharing it with you that you've been working in for quite a while. So yeah, there's a lot of through line / connection there, and I also feel the importance of documenting or documentation, like you're doing in relation to not only community members and folks, but also spaces or places that may not exist given, the straight washing, like we're talking about, or homonormativity, or well, that too, but heteronormativity. Whoops, that was a slip, but it's also true. But in relation to work, I think we have a lot of conversations to say. So
Yeah, and I know we have some questions from the audience that are
yes,
popping up, but I just want to say before we go to those in a second, I think for me, you were and are an example of what a trans future can look like for me, like a real life personal example of that. And that has just always been true. I think even before I knew you and just knew your work. I also think that the ways that you write about and make work about these like lost queer Chicago spaces, like the Belmont Rocks, for example, reminds me a lot of the work that I've been doing, like writing about the closing of man's country in my own neighborhood. And I see a lot of that influence coming through. So thank you for that.
for sure. All right. Thanks, Ismail. I feel like wonderful full circle here. So there's a couple of questions from out there for folks listening. So the first question is, you mentioned that much of your writing happened in collectives or workshops. Does your work that you write when you're solo have a different sentiment, or is your writing always inspired by live collaboration?
That's a great question. I think the work that I write when I'm literally like alone in my bed late at night or early in the morning, it's one, a lot more difficult for me to write that way, but I think it also is more difficult because I'm often writing about more personal issues or ideas that I may not be comfortable talking about yet in a group of people. Sometimes I find the opposite is true too, where I like started talking about being trans in poems before I started talking about it in like my actual like daily life. And I like was reading poems in workshops about being trans before like I really realized what that was. But I think now, yeah, it's often like, I think the difference is in community, people reflect back to you what it is you're writing about. And so for me, it was really clear when I was writing poems about being trans and other people were responding to them, sitting across from me and taking them in, like that was really powerful. And so I think when I'm by myself or when I'm not able to be in community, I often am like I'm writing many drafts. I am working through what it is I'm trying to write about. I'm doing exercises just much more informally. I'm doing like more journaling that is not necessarily going to be shared with anyone. I'm like writing lists. I'm writing notes of like, talks that I'm listening to, or I'm writing down quotes from books that I'm reading. I think that my best work is definitely made in community. And when I'm by myself, it's more like I'm often editing and refining and like revising my work, just like really trying to polish it.
And then there was a follow-up. Can you talk about that beautiful flag behind you after that first question? So
yeah. So there's a big trans flag behind me, 3 foot by 5 foot. It says "I'm alive" in purple glitter paint, which I put on there with my own hands. That's my handwriting / hand lettering. And it sits currently where it sits in my apartment. It sits right across from my bed. So it's the first thing that I see when I wake up in the morning, or the last thing that I see before I go to bed. And it's just a constant reminder to myself, very literally, that I am alive. And it's, it's just, so it's like almost like an affirmation. Like it's really just like something that I always, even if I'm not like reading it to myself consciously when I wake up or when I go to bed, it's there and it's always in the background. And I can read it, I can be reminded. It's very hard to miss. It's very large on my wall. And so it's an important part of like keeping myself alive.
for sure. Appreciate that. The next question is, what do you love most about Chicago? Is there an aspect of Chicago that you see that comes across more than once in your writing, like a sort of theme?
Yeah, I love this question. What I love most about Chicago is very easy. It's the people. I love the people here. I love the art and writing that is created here, or by people who have some sort of relationship to the city. It really is the people for me. And I think that often the people can really make a place. And I think similarly in my work, it's often like similar people who are coming up again and again. For example, there's a couple of poems in this book where I mentioned my friend River, and you see River kind of in different contexts, and you see Sylvie in different contexts, and you see like this community of trans folks and friends at different moments in my life and in theirs. And I think in that way, as well as like the Chicago artists who I'm writing poems after or mentioning, in that way, like that is my way of honoring them, is both responding to their work, like shouting them out, but also reminding them of how important they are to me, and literally writing their name down and publishing it, and even just sharing a small moment, whether that's at the Chicago Marathon or in a hospital, and just like marking that, we were here and we shared these moments together, and a little bit about what those moments meant to me.
Very good, thanks. There's another question. When doing historical research in trans history, did anything surprise you? It's great to acknowledge that ancestors are not simply connected by family. Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah. What surprised me? I think that, so when I was at the Newberry Library, and I was like trying to research trans history, I like had a lot of difficulty finding materials, finding books and information and buttons and posters. And at first it was really disappointing to me. And at first it was really hard because the Newberry Library, for example, has tons and tons and tons of collections, especially related to the city. And, you know, they're this massive archive and library that's been around for a really long time. And so to approach that collection and at first not find what I was looking for, especially in relationship to trans Chicago history, was like really kind of upsetting. But I think as I went on and as I've done more sort of historical research, what I found is that, you know, if you're not, just because you're not finding something, especially in these institutional spaces, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean that you can't reshape that collection or archive or library or institution. You know, I think before I had ever shown work at the Leather Archives, for example, it wasn't really a space where I felt like trans people were celebrated. And now, just a few weeks ago, like I saw this amazing play put on by trans artists that was incredible. And, you know, there were a ton of trans people in the audience. And that's really beautiful. So I think turning to community, turning to oral histories, talking with elders, interviewing them, you know, those are the sorts of sources that I think are really important and have really helped me. And as I see like collections or museums or libraries evolving or changing or beginning to highlight different parts of their collections, that really excites me. And it's also like we can shape those spaces. You know, we're shaping history right now. It's not like history is this untouchable, untangible thing, right? Like we're all part of creating history, and we all have histories that are important and deserve to be shared with future generations.
Thanks for that. This is the closing question. Oh, wait. Thank you so much for being here. Is there a way to get an autographed copy of the book? That was part of the last question I asked you around historical research. It's a second question in relation to that. So yeah, how do we get an autographed copy of your book?
Yeah, so I'll combine that with the other question. Can you recommend more activists and authors that the audience should check out? Absolutely. So you can get signed copies of my book. You're welcome to order through Women and Children First, which is a local Chicago bookstore. You can order the book online through them and just write a comment of who you want the book signed to, and that can get shipped to you, or you can pick it up in person if you're local. As far as activists and authors the audience should check out, I would definitely recommend learning more about Mama Gloria, because she's local and she just passed, and there's actually a short film about her that you can watch. And I think later this week there's going to be a celebration of her life at the Southside Community Art Center, which is also a very important artist space and communal space in Chicago. Another person who I love is Lou Sullivan. Lou grew up in Milwaukee and later moved to San Francisco, and was someone who helped build like the GLBT archive in San Francisco, was an early organizer, organizing a lot of like trans men and trans masculine people in San Francisco. And there's a great book of his journals that I highly recommend called We Both Laughed in Pleasure. And that's a great book that you can check out from the library or grab from your local bookstore. So those are two who are top of mind.
Thanks so much, HML. This has been obviously a pleasure, but also an honor to sit down with you over the interwebs. And I want to thank you so much, Gracias, and I want to send it over back to Mariela. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for this evening. I want to thank H. Mount and Oli Rodriguez for leading such a great discussion and so many books that I need to catch up on and historical figures that we weren't taught about in school that we really need to learn more about, especially as it pertains to Midwest history. So H. Mount's book, again, is called There Are Trans People Here. And you can check it out at the Chicago Public Library or any of your other local libraries, but we also encourage you to visit any of Chicago's independent bookstores to purchase a copy, including Women and Children First. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube and Facebook page. If you have friends who weren't able to join us tonight, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you both H. Mount and Oli, and thanks to everyone tuning in, and have a wonderful rest of your Pride Month. Good evening.